Silicon Valley, late 1980s. In glossy trade magazines and neon-lit labs, a new kind of machine is quietly rewriting what a computer looks like. These aren't beige PCs for spreadsheets, and they're not room-filling mainframes either. They're sleek Unix workstations from Sun, HP, SGI, purpose-built for engineers, scientists, and animators, pushing the limits of what silicon can do. And standing just off to the side of this battle is a giant digital equipment corporation, DEC, a company that practically defined minicomputing in the 1970s and early 80s, suddenly finds itself fighting for relevance in a world that seems to be pivoting to Unix, RISC processors, and desktop-sized power. This is the story of DEC's DECstation and DEC System 5000 line, a family of MIPS-based Unix workstations that arrived right in the middle of the workstation wars. It's a story of bold engineering, corporate hesitation, and a bet on someone else's CPU at the exact moment DEC was trying to reinvent itself. And it all starts with a simple question: how does a minicomputer legend adapt when the future shrinks down to a single desk? To understand why the DECstation 5000 existed at all, you have to rewind to DEC's heyday. In the 1970s and early 80s, Digital Equipment Corporation was the cool kid of corporate computing. While IBM sold massive mainframes, DEC's PDP and VAX minicomputers put serious power into labs, universities, and tech-savvy companies at a fraction of the size and cost. Their flagship was the VAX line, running DEC's own operating system, VMS. If you were doing serious scientific work, time-sharing, or enterprise computing, VAX/VMS was a safe, sophisticated choice. Entire institutions standardized on it. DEC had its own hardware, its own OS, its own software ecosystem, and for a while, that vertical integration looked like an unbeatable moat. But outside DEC's walls, Unix was quietly conquering the world. Universities adopted BSD and System V flavors. Startups like Sun Microsystems built their entire identity around Unix workstations. Instead of centralized minicomputers with terminals, you had powerful desktops running Unix locally, networked together with Unet. By the mid-1980s, DEC could see the writing on the wall. If it stayed purely a VAX/VMS company, it risked losing a whole generation of users who were learning Unix in school and expecting Unix at work. DEC needed to play in the Unix workstation market or watch Sun and others eat its lunch. The Unix workstation market emerged at an awkward time for companies like DEC. On one hand, they already sold powerful systems to many of the same customers: universities, research labs, engineering firms. On the other, the buying pattern was changing. Instead of buying one big system and a bunch of dumb terminals, departments wanted many smaller, independent machines. Sun's business model was brutally simple: standardize on Unix, embrace open networking protocols, and offer consistently improving RISC-based workstations at aggressive prices. HP and others followed a similar playbook. DEC's response was complicated. It had Ultrix, a Unix derived from BSD, running on its VAX hardware. It dabbled with Unix servers and workstations, but these early steps always felt like side projects compared to the main VAX/VMS business. Meanwhile, a big architectural shift was brewing. The industry was moving from complex instruction set computing, CISC, toward reduced instruction set computing, RISC. MIPS, SPARC, PA RISC, and others promised higher performance per transistor and better compiler-friendly designs. For a company like DEC, deeply invested in its own VAX-CISC architecture, this was both a threat and an opportunity. The stage was set: a Unix-hungry market, a RISC revolution, and a minicomputer titan needing a new workstation story. DEC's first serious steps into RISC Unix workstations came with the DECstation 3100, introduced in the late 1980s. This machine was powered not by a VAX chip, but by a MIPS RISC processor, a striking shift for a company that had historically built its own CPU architectures. Why MIPS? From the outside, it looked like a pragmatic move. MIPS offered off-the-shelf RISC designs that could get DEC into the RISC workstation game quickly, without waiting for its internal long-term projects to mature. And customers were already getting comfortable with MIPS thanks to companies like SGI. Internally, though, this wasn't a simple choice. DEC's engineering culture was proud of its homegrown architectures. At the same time that MIPS-based machines were coming to market, DEC engineers were working on ambitious RISC designs of their own, projects like Prism and eventually Alpha. Those efforts promised a clean, DEC-controlled future, so the early DE stations and the 5000 line that would follow lived in a kind of strategic tension. They were both a bridge into the Unix/RISC world, and a reminder that DEC was temporarily riding on someone else's technology while it figured out its own next-generation CPU story. For customers, though, what mattered most was that the DECstation name now stood for fast, Unix-ready workstations that could compete with Sun's Workstations head-on. Building on the momentum of the 3100, DEC rolled out the DECstation and DECsystem 5000 family MIPS-based systems designed to cover a range of needs from desk-side workstations to small servers. If you were reading spec sheets at the time, you'd see model numbers like 5025, 5125, 5133, and 5150 on the lower end, and 5200, 5240, and 5260 higher up the line. Under the hood, many of these machines were built around the MIPS R3000 processor, a solid 32-bit RISC CPU, with later models like the 5264-bit MIPS R4000. Clock speeds and cache sizes varied, but the overall arc was clear. Each new model nudged performance up to keep pace with Sun and HP. DEC distinguished between DECstation and DECsystem branding, mainly by intended role. Workstations with graphics for users versus headless or minimally graphical machines intended as servers. In practice, they shared much of the same core technology. If you were an engineer in the early 90s and someone rolled a 5000 tower into your office, you were getting a serious Unix machine with DEC's badge on the front and MIPS silicon at its heart. One of the defining technical features of the DECstation 5000 line was its I/O bus, TURBOchannel. This was DEC's own high-speed expansion bus, designed to connect graphics cards, network adapters, and other peripherals without the bottlenecks of older architectures. For graphics, the 5000 series offered a range of options depending on model and budget. Entry-level setups might have simple frame buffers adequate for 2DX11 work, while higher-end configurations supported more advanced graphics hardware suited to CAD, visualization, and scientific plotting. The exact model names and capabilities varied, and compared to SGI's flamboyant 3D offerings, DEC's graphics story was more about solid 2D and workstation class displays than cutting-edge animation. The combination of MIPS CPUs, TURBOchannel, and decent graphics made the 5000 line attractive in domains where interactive Unix desktops mattered: engineering offices, university labs, chip design groups, and scientific research centers. These weren't gaming machines, they were the kind of boxes you used to compile large code bases, run simulations, or work on complex schematics and layouts day after day. So who actually bought DECstation and DECsystem 5000 machines? The answer overlaps heavily with DEC's traditional strongholds, but with a Unix twist. Universities and research labs adopted them as general-purpose Unix workhorses, machines for graduate students, postdocs, and faculty who needed something more powerful and robust than a PC running DOS, but cheaper and more flexible than time on a large VAX. Engineering departments used them for CAD, EDA, and numerical analysis. Commercial customers bought 5000s as networked workstations and small servers. You'd find a DECsystem 5000 in a machine room serving NFS home directories, or a DECstation on an engineer's desk running X11, email, and the in-house tools that glued projects together. In some settings, they coexisted with VAX/VMS systems, bridging the old and new worlds. From a user's perspective, a DECstation 5000 felt like a serious, professional Unix box with DEC's industrial design and support behind it. Reassuring for managers, but still very much a RISC workstation, competing in a crowded field. At the software level, the DECstation 5000 story is inseparable from Ultrix, DEC's in-house Unix. Derived primarily from BSD, Ultrix brought a familiar Unix environment to DEC hardware, complete with networking stacks, development tools, and X11 for graphical desktops. Ultrix had a mixed reputation. On one hand, it was a reasonably capable Unix with features that appealed to academia and developers who liked BSD-style systems. On the other hand, DEC sometimes seemed ambivalent about treating Unix as a first-class citizen alongside VMS. That abolition showed up in marketing and in the way certain features were prioritized. For the DECstation line, Ultrix was both a selling point and a limitation. Customers who wanted a standardized Unix environment across vendors sometimes found DEC's flavor quirky compared to Sun OS or later Solaris. Systems administrators had to decide whether the benefits of DEC hardware and support outweighed the friction of managing yet another Unix variant in a heterogeneous network. Still, For many installations, Ultrix did its job quietly, a solid Unix that made DECstation 5000s fit into the broader Unix ecosystem without too many surprises. As the early 1990s unfolded, DEC's Unix story started to shift. The company became involved in the Open Software Foundation, a consortium effort that produced its own Unix variant, OSF1. DEC saw OSF1 as the strategic future, especially on its upcoming 64-bit alpha architecture. There were OSF1 offerings associated with DEC's RISC systems, but the real emphasis landed on alpha rather than MIPS. In many ways, the DECstation 5000 line found itself on the wrong side of a turning point. Ultrix, while serviceable, looked increasingly like a legacy choice. OSF1 on alpha promised modern features, 64-bit clean design, and a clearer long-term roadmap. For customers, this created a familiar kind of unease. Do you keep buying MIPS-based stations running Ultrix, knowing they're not on the cutting-edge path? Or do you wait for alpha systems and OSF1 to mature? Historical accounts differ on how aggressively DEC messaged this transition, but the net effect is easy to see in hindsight. Software strategy that was evolving away from the very platform DEC had just spent years promoting. Against this backdrop, how did the DECstation 5000 family stack up in the market? Technically, they were competitive. MIPS processors offered solid performance. TURBOchannel gave good I/O bandwidth. Ultrix provided a familiar Unix environment. On paper, a 5000 model could go toe-to-toe with many Workstations. But workstation buyers don't live on spec sheets alone. Sun had built an incredibly strong ecosystem. Solaris NFS, a deep catalog of third-party applications, and a reputation for being the default Unix workstation vendor. SGI owned the high-end visualization niche. HP and IBM had their own loyal bases. DEC, by contrast, was still known primarily for VAX/VMS. Its Unix workstation line sometimes felt like an add-on rather than the company's soul. Sales figures from the era are patchy and often anecdotal, but most historians agree that DEC never matched Sun's sheer volume in the Unix workstation space. In many accounts from former users, DECstation 5000s are remembered fondly for their reliability and performance, just not as the obvious first-choice platform that Sun often was. DEC had good hardware in a market where it didn't fully control the narrative. Beyond pure technical merit, DEC's broader business struggles weighed heavily on the 5000 line. The company was grappling with declining margins in its traditional minicomputer business, the rise of PCs and low-end servers, and internal debates over which futures to bet on. Investing heavily in MIPS-based workstations made sense as a stopgap, but it didn't always receive the kind of sustained, single-minded push that Sun poured into Workstations. Marketing budgets, software porting efforts, and long-term roadmaps were all being pulled in multiple directions: VAX, MIPS, and the looming alpha architecture. In this environment, even a solid product line can underperform. The DECstation 5000 series found customers, especially among those already loyal to DEC or with specific needs. But in the bigger picture, they weren't enough to reverse DEC's slide or to redefine the company's public image as a Unix workstation powerhouse. Instead, they became one more pillar in a complex, sometimes confusing product portfolio at a time when clarity might have mattered more than ever. By the early 1990s, DEC had made its decision. The company's future would rest on Alpha, a 64-bit RISC architecture designed in-house to be fast, scalable, and unambiguously DEC's. Alpha AXP systems would run both OpenVMS and OSF1, giving DEC a high-end story that felt cohesive and under its control. That decision, while technologically impressive, had an immediate consequence for the MIPS-based DECstation 5000 line. It marked them as a dead end. New alpha workstations and servers began to arrive, promising more performance and a clearer roadmap. MIPS-based systems, no matter how capable, now lived under the shadow of eventual retirement. Support cycles continued, and installed 5000s didn't vanish overnight, but the writing was on the wall. For new purchases, customers with long-time horizons were encouraged, implicitly or explicitly, to look at Alpha instead. The DECstation brand would fade as Alpha stations and Alpha servers took center stage. In retrospect, this pivot makes the 5000 line feel like a transitional fossil, evidence of DEC's urgent need to be in the Unix/RISC game before its own crown jewel architecture was ready. As the 1990s progressed, the combination of internal shifts and external pressure squeezed the DECstation 5000 family out of the spotlight. Alpha took over the high-end story, commodity PCs and low-cost Unix boxes began eating into the workstation market from below. Meanwhile, DEC itself was struggling financially and organizationally. Model by model, the MIPS-based systems were discontinued. New software development centered on alpha, and while patches and maintenance kept 5000s useful for years in some organizations, they were no longer the focus of DEC's future. By the time Compaq acquired DEC in the late 1990s, the DECstation name was already history. What remained were aging towers and labs and machine rooms, gradually powered down, sold off, or repurposed. In the grand narrative of DEC's decline, the DECstation 5000 series occupies a chapter that's easy to overlook, but it captures a moment when DEC was trying very hard to find its footing in a changing industry. Today, the DECstation and DECsystem 5000 line enjoys a second life in a very different community: retrocomputing enthusiasts and computer historians. To collectors, these machines represent more than just MIPS workstations. They're physical artifacts from a pivotal transition in computing. Power one up today, and you're greeted by a very specific early 90s Unix experience. Ultrix boot messages, thick CRT-era fonts, X11 desktops that feel Spartan compared to modern GUIs. For those who use them in their careers, that's a dose of pure nostalgia. For younger enthusiasts, it's a window into a time when workstations were exotic, expensive, and aspirational. Their legacy in computing history is nuanced. The 5000 line didn't redefine the market or save DEC, but it did prove that DEC could build credible RISC Unix workstations, and it kept many customers in DEC's orbit long enough to consider later transitions. Technically, they showcase solid engineering and a willingness to adopt external architectures when needed. In a way, their current cult status says as much about us as about DEC. We're fascinated by the crossroads where big companies made hard bets, and by the hardware that lived briefly in those in-between spaces. Step back from the circuit boards, and the DECstation 5000 story becomes a lens on DEC itself. Here was a company that had built its identity on controlling the whole stack: CPU, operating system, software ecosystem, suddenly shipping machines powered by MIPS, running a Unix that competed with its own VMS. That tension reflects DEC's broader struggle to adapt from the minicomputer era to a world of workstations and soon, commodity PCs and servers. The 5000 series shows DEC at its most pragmatic and its most conflicted, willing to embrace RISC and Unix, yet always half-turned toward its own next big thing. The ultimate decline of DEC had many causes: market shifts, pricing pressures, internal complexity, and fierce competition. The DECstation 5000 line didn't cause that decline, but it does capture a snapshot of the company in mid-transformation, trying multiple strategies at once and never quite committing to a single, focused workstation identity. For tech history fans, that makes the 5000 series one of the more interesting what-if machines. What if DEC had doubled down on MIPS? What if its Unix strategy had been clearer earlier? We can't know, but the hardware that shipped gives us clues to the paths taken and the ones left behind. Return for a moment to that late 80s, early 90s lab. Rows of humming workstations, CRTs glowing, Sun logos on some cases, DEC badging on others. In that room, the workstation wars weren't an abstract business story. They were the tools people used to design chips, analyze data, write code, and discover new science. The DECstation and DECsystem 5000 line never became the default choice of that era, but they carved out a distinct place in it. Solid, capable MIPS RISC workhorses built by a company racing to reinvent itself. They stood at the crossroads between VAX minicomputers and alpha super workstations, between proprietary stacks and the messy, vibrant world of Unix. Today, most of those machines are gone, replaced by laptops and cloud instances that dwarf them in raw performance. But understanding their story and DEC's story reminds us that technological shifts are rarely clean or inevitable. They're made of bets, compromises, and transitional machines, like the DECstation 5000, that carried users one project at a time, from one era of computing into the next. For those who still fire one up on a bench or keep a 5000 tower in the corner of a home lab, that hum is more than just a fan. It's an echo from the workstation wars, and from a moment when DEC was still very much in the fight.